The jeep drove slowly along a pathway that had been created by wooden barriers, over which people would often hold their small children for the Pope to pick up and bless. He had just returned a little girl to her parents and was driving towards the bronze doors of the Apostolic Palace at 5:13 p.m. when hundreds of pigeons suddenly flew into the evening air. A fraction of a second later, thanks to the peculiar acoustics of the square, they all knew the reason why. Standing behind the row of pilgrims at one of the wooden railings, Muhammad Ali Agca had just fired 2 shots at the Pope from a Browning 9mm semi-automatic pistol. John Paul was struck in the abdomen and fell backward into the arms of his secretary. The image of the inert Pope reminded millions of people of the artistic renderings of Christ being taken from the cross. That is an excerpt from the book I'm going to be talking to you about today, and which I had covered in the previous episode, John Paul II, Part 1. It is titled Witness to Hope by George Weigel. I split this up into 2 parts because the book is extremely long. It's almost 1,000 pages, and I just wanted to make sure I took the proper time with the man and saint that is John Paul II. So Part 1 ended with Muhammad Ali Agca plotting to kill the Pope and waiting for him to drive by. I think John Paul's response that we'll see shortly here, his response to getting shot and almost dying and surviving perfectly frames the type of man that he is, and also supports the common themes that we have seen so far in the book and that we're going to see throughout the rest of the book, fundamentally of unity and evangelization. So this is a quote directly from John Paul II out of the book. "I am particularly close to the 2 persons who suffered together with me." 2 other people were injured in the shooting as well. "I pray for that brother of ours who shot me and whom I have sincerely pardoned. United with Christ, priest and victim, I offer my suffering for the church and for the world. In the designs of providence, there are no mere coincidences." So ultimately, it's not clear what Agca, his exact motivations were, but some speculate it was religiously motivated. We read the letter that he wrote in Part 1 about being offended by the commander of the Crusades visiting his country. Others speculate, however, that it was Soviet influence. This is at the height of the Cold War, and John Paul II, of course, is very influential in his contradiction to the Soviet system. So again, despite being shot twice and almost killed by the would-be assassin, John Paul II goes and meets with him at the prison that he's being held at. So on December 27th, this is a quote from the book, "On December 27th, 1983, John Paul II gave a personal witness to the imperative of reconciliation by celebrating Mass at the prison his would-be assassin, Muhammad Ali Agca, was housed. Photos of their encounter show Agca listening intensely to John Paul, whose left hand was open and slightly raised in a characteristic gesture of explanation or instruction. Speculation immediately surfaced that Agca had made some sort of confession. In fact, what had happened was that the superstitious Turk had told John Paul of his fears that Our Lady of Fatima was going to wreak vengeance on him. The assassination attempt and Agca's escape had been planned so perfectly that Agca was astounded to find himself in prison and had come to attribute the Pope's survival and his imprisonment to supernatural power. He had read in prison that the assassination attempt had taken place on the anniversary of the apparition at Fatima, and he had concluded that the goddess of Fatima, who had served the Pope, was now going to do away with him. John Paul patiently explained that Mary, who many Muslims venerated as the Mother of God, loves all people and that he shouldn't be afraid." So think about that in your and our lives. The small infractions that we refuse to forgive people for, or we hold grudges for the simplest things, the humility and grace that it took for John Paul to not only forgive the person who attempted to assassinate him, but to console and have a relationship with him. That is absolutely incredible, and I think it exemplifies how John Paul was different and why he ultimately goes on to become a saint. So at this point in time, we're in the mid-'80s. John Paul was elected Pope in the late 70s. And he is taking on communism in his preaching of the gospel and his refusal to back down on issues of freedom, especially in Soviet-controlled countries, and the unique dignity of the human person. So back to the book here. John Paul II's evenly focused view of history and politics helps get into focus his relationship to another salient actor of the world stage in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan, the President of the United States. The Pope and the President held certain common convictions. They both believed that communism was a moral evil, not simply wrong-headed economics. They were both confident of the capacity of free people to meet the communist challenge. Both were convinced that in the contest with communism, victory, not accommodation, was possible. Both had a sense of the drama of the late 20th century history, and both were confident that the spoken word of truth could cut through the static of communism's lies. So while John Paul II doesn't often speak directly to or against the Soviet Union, his very leadership is antithetical to the communist system's existence and what it preaches. John Paul II preaches freedom of the individual, which is the opposite of the community, of the preaching of the Soviet Union. He completely contradicts what the world says and ultimately what the Soviet Union says about the individual. And so this bold and intentional teaching brings the world closer to Christ. He's not worried about the criticism of being wrong or what the governments are going to think of him. He simply focuses on preaching the truth. Back to the book. The civilization of love must rise strongly and vigorously in a people reconciled where hatred, violence, and injustice will be no more. A society in which there will always be complete respect for the inalienable rights of the human person and the legitimate freedom of the individual and the family. It is only a true and deep reconciliation of each with God and with all mankind that the desired harmony will be achieved. The mystery of the Eucharist is in no way alien to the building of a new world. Rather, it is its principal source of inspiration because the Lord Jesus is the foundation of a new humanity that is reconciled and fraternal. So, the direct action that John Paul does take in relation to the Soviet Union is not antagonistic, but it's one that's founded on respect. One example of this in his many formal meetings and letters between communist countries is his meeting with Gorbachev, the leader of the Soviet Union at the time. So he meets with John Paul II in Rome and brings his wife. And after having met with John Paul II for an hour and a half, he introduces his wife in this manner. I have the honor to introduce the highest moral authority on earth. Then he added with a chuckle, and he's Slavic like us. When they came out of the People's Library to rejoin their respective parties and make formal statements, no one in the room was immune to the excitement of the moment. It was electric, and even the veteran reporters themselves felt caught up in it. So after just an hour and a half meeting, Gorbachev is impacted so greatly that he promises in his formal statements a new law on religious freedom in the Soviet Union, and he celebrates the work the Pope has done in bringing nations together. This is absolutely incredible. Just an hour and a half with John Paul II could change the history of the world. It speaks to his holiness, which transcends cultures and borders and nations. And I think as you and I reflect on this, our mission should be no less. Why can't you or I deal with the people in our lives with the same manner? The people that we see as our adversaries, why can't we build similar bridges? Surely we have more in common with them than John Paul II had with the leader of the Soviet Union. So in addition to John Paul's role in defeating communism, another common theme throughout his papacy is his focus on solidarity or union or fellowship between people. So he's focused on solidarity amongst several different groups of people, but he focuses a lot on young people, Jews, Muslims, and Eastern Orthodox, and travels more than any pope in recent history in support of those goals, going on pilgrimages all over the world. So specifically, he's completely unprecedented in his approach to Judaism and demonstrates this by being the first pope to visit the Roman synagogue in over 1,000 years. This is a quote from the book. About this visit, this was neither a civic meeting nor the ceremony of a beginning of a negotiation. This was a religious encounter between people who should give thanks and praise to the Lord together. So he's the first pope to speak in front of and also be invited to speak by a Muslim audience. And he has such an impact on this audience of young people in Casablanca that many people say that the audience there was far more interested in what he had to say than in some of his other pilgrimages to other European countries that were Catholic. So how can we learn from this and as we spoke about previously, build bridges with people that are in our lives that may seem to be as adversaries. So we can strive for unity, just as John Paul II did. As we look to John Paul II's approach to Eastern Orthodoxy, there's a common theme and metaphor that is seen throughout the book that John Paul II said throughout his life, and that is that his high-level desire is that the two lungs of Christ begin to breathe together again. So what he's using in this metaphor is describing the Latin church as one lung and the Eastern Orthodox church as the other lung. He wants to bring the two back together so that the two lungs of Christ can breathe together again. It's really powerful. In regards to young people, he instills a sense of solidarity, the way he preaches about their mission and that they have a unique destiny that they're called to. Back to the book here. Youth is also a special time to discern a personal future, a vocation in which young people try to read the eternal thought which God the Creator and Father has in their regard. Discovering one's unique person and task is a fascinating interior undertaking in which your humanity develops and grows. While your young personality acquires ever greater inner maturity, you become rooted in that which each of you is, in order to become that which you must become for yourself, for other people, for God. This is incredible. John Paul is saying that we each have a unique destiny here. There's something in this world that only you or I can achieve, and it is our duty, it is our mission to pursue this life's work so that we can become who God made us to be. In speaking at the World Youth Day in Spain, John Paul also says that one came to learn what Jesus had meant when he told James, John, and the other 10 that whoever would be great among you must be your servant. Those words were the essential criterion of human greatness. As he had with James and John, Christ demanded a radical commitment from his followers today. He did not want mediocrity. For a Christian, mediocrity meant measuring one's commitment by a self-devised standard and thinking of anything beyond that as the preserve of the professional saint. Mediocrity was not what the church and the world of the 21st century needed. Young people, the Pope knew, wanted to improve the world they had inherited and to do so in freedom. That required not mediocrity, but saints. Do not be afraid to be saints. This is the liberty for which Christ has set us free. Dear young people, let yourselves be won by him. This is exactly what you and I are trying to accomplish here by learning about saints, by studying holy people and saints. We are seeking to learn the lessons from their lives and how we can emulate it in our own. In that same vein, we cannot accept mediocrity. We have to learn from the saints, apply the lessons in our own life to sanctify the world. It's our duty. In synthesis, with this call to achieve our destiny, John Paul also has extremely important things to say about the laity's role in the church, which is really important, about that role not being passive, but that the laity has a specific and important role in the church militant or the church on earth. It is not permissible for anyone to remain idle. The sanctification of the world, society, culture, the workplace is the distinctly secular vocation of the laity. The laity have the right and obligation to mission by reason of their baptism. Any suggestion that they can only exercise this mission by imitating the clergy means the grace of baptism is falsified and that the church as communion, being the church, is not something that the laity can do on Sunday mornings only, and it is not something that should only happen in church buildings. Being the church is something that the laity should do in the world all the time and in every venue of life. Business, the professions, the creative arts, media, and politics are, for the Pope, all venues in which Christians live the universal call to holiness. So as you and I reflect on this, how are we being the church? How are we living out our specific vocation that God has called us to? Are we doing everything we should be, like John Paul II is asking here? So in the mid-90s, John Paul II's health begins and continues to deteriorate despite his very active life throughout his earlier papacy and career as a priest. He develops some hip issues. He has a hip replacement, and ultimately he develops Parkinson's disease and a tremor in his left arm and hand, but he bears everything with Christ's peace and joy. Ultimately, though, after a 26-year pontificate, John Paul's condition worsens, and in 2005 has an infection and develops septic shock. And on April 2nd, 2005, he says his last words, Allow me to depart to the house of the Father," and falls into a coma and dies later that day. Following his death, Pope John Paul II is beatified May 1st, 2011, and canonized April 27th, 2014, after miracles attributed to his intercession were approved, and he is now known as St. John Paul II. So it's really difficult to measure the impact that John Paul II had on the 20th century, and even after reading this book, I also find it difficult to measure that because it was such a large impact. But I think G.K. Chesterton's description of Sir Thomas More illustrates it well. He said, "He was above all things historic. He represented at once a type, a turning point, and an ultimate destiny. If there had not been that particular man at that particular moment, the whole of history would have been different." John Paul II was not one more player in the politics of nations. He had come, he said, because he was a witness to hope. We must not be afraid of the future. We must not be afraid of man. It is no accident that we are here. Each and every human person has been created in the image and likeness of the one who is the origin of all that is. We have within us the capacities for wisdom and virtue. With these gifts and with the help of God's grace, we can build in the next century and the next millennium a civilization worthy of the human person, a true culture of freedom. We can and we must do so. And in doing so, we shall see that the tears of this century have prepared the ground for a new springtime of the human spirit. So that is where I'll leave it for now. Again, this book is titled Witness to Hope by George Weigel. There's much, much more in the book that I do not cover here. If you would like to purchase the book, there's a link to it in the description below. And if you would like to support the podcast, please purchase it through that link. Thank you, and Deo gratias.